When comic artists are drawing, they're attempting to replicate a visual that an audience can both understand and interpret. It's not just about creating a realistic rendition of something, but it's also about getting across a sense of mood, or place, or purpose. There's intent behind the work, behind each panel. With cinema, each shot you take is filtered through a lens. Different lenses have different properties, and they can imbue the exact same scene with different meanings. The same is very true of artists and panels in a comic book, only instead of there being a lens, it's just the artist who filters the image through his or her mind, deciding how it will end up. But artists are influenced by different mediums themselves, and that kind of all feeds into their work as well. This episode, I wanted to take a look at Daredevil number 37 by Brian Michael Bendis, Maleev and Matt Hollingsworth to discuss how they build a visual style through the pages, what it means, and kind of where it came from. You're watching Strip Panel Naked. As always, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So, to begin, I think it's worth talking about the lens comparison again very briefly, and getting a full understanding of what that means. I've taken this very basic example from the lens manufacturer Tamron's website to help illustrate it. If you've ever used a camera with a zoom lens before, you'll know that the more that you're zoomed in, the tighter the focus on the specific thing that you're shooting. If you're further away, you zoom in and the image looks bigger, right? It gets rid of all the other stuff around it, it's pretty simple. But there's another effect that happens with the optics, and this image is a good example. If we kept our subject at the same size by physically moving the camera around, so on a wider angle lens we would get a little bit closer to them, and on a more zoomed in lens we would go further away, you would start to notice something happening with the background. By keeping the subject still, you can see that effect very, very clearly. The tighter or more zoomed in the lens, the more condensed the background becomes, and with that wide angle lens you can see a lot more of the world around that person. So with the 28mm example there, that's a pretty wide lens, so in that image we get to understand both the subject, the woman, and also her surroundings as well. It gives her a sense of place, and that place now informs how we view that image. It's not just a picture of a woman, it's a picture of a woman in a place. By contrast, when we hit the 200mm example, which is really, really zoomed in, we lose that. The image just becomes her and nothing else really. The background is kind of too cramped and squashed to really understand anything else. So we can only work with the idea of it being that woman. It stops being a picture of a woman and a place and just becomes a picture of a woman. Right, okay, fine, but how does that relate to comics? I can hear you asking. Well, Maleev actually brings that cinematic trick into his work, and you can see it a lot in this issue of Daredevil. In essence, he moves the camera further away from his characters, and he uses a zoomed in lens to compress the background, so we never wander from where he wants us to. You can see it on the very first page of the comic with a conversation between Elektra and Matt Murdock, Daredevil. In the few panels where you can actually make out a background, there's not a wide enough landscape for it to have any meaning. The best chance you've got is panels 3 or 5 maybe, with this signage behind Matt. But it's so compressed that it means very, very little, if anything, and it in no way pulls you to start digging around in the background. It doesn't even ask you to really contextualize it. You know it exists, but it's tight and compressed enough that it doesn't mean anything to our understanding of the actual page. And most importantly, it keeps our attention on the two main players. Which also informs another part of the technique of Maleev and Bendis in this book. It's how claustrophobic the whole thing is. The issue is almost exclusively tight shots of characters, and with a few wides peppered in throughout for effect, but mostly what we get is panels right up in people's faces. In the first page we have these 6 panels, 4 of which are close-ups right on the faces of Elektra or Matt. One of the other panels, panel 4, is a condensed shot on Elektra's upper body and face, and the other, panel 1, is drenched in caption boxes and filled up with Elektra. It's a very aggressive page. It creates like a really heavy sense of lack of freedom, right? Those narrow panels, 2 and 3, restrict the view, and the rest are just crammed with faces. And thematically, that does make a lot of sense. So in this story arc, Matt Murdock's secret identity as Daredevil has been revealed in the media, and there's this kind of big media circus closing in around him. It restricts his freedom and his movement. And this page starts to really reflect that. And furthermore, the effect is doubled down with Matt Hollingsworth's beautiful colour work, very muted turquoise. It limits the saturation of any colours and it gives everything this kind of cold, icy tint. And again, with colour theory, we understand that blue tends to mean cold. And that's how this feels. It doesn't feel very warm, it feels very alienating. And the second page keeps that theme going, with the blue tint covering everything. It also keeps restricting the background information in panel 1, where you get a very rough sense of the fact that we're on a rooftop, but not much else. The focus by Maleev remains very clearly on Murdock and being drawn to Elektra through the use of that ribbon flailing in the wind. We get this extreme close-up on Elektra's eyes next, and then the first sense of a world larger than just the two of them in this third panel. And it's hard to overstate how much I love this page layout, because it starts to speak so much about the trapped nature of Matt Murdock in the life he's now living. Because Elektra leaps off the building, and look at the world in front of her. Open, vast, like you could go anywhere and see it all. But look where Maleev has placed Matt Murdock, trapped by his own panel, crammed right into the corner, separated away from Elektra and the world, literally backed into the corner. It lines up with the narration in the captions about being consumed and followed by the media and his freedom being very limited. It's a beautiful representation of that. And furthermore, we talked about the fact that he's cornered by that panel of himself, which is exactly the situation. He's trapped by the duality of his character of being both Matt Murdock and Daredevil. He, in a sense, has trapped himself into this. Then you get the shot of Murdock jumping off the building, and it's been placed directly below where Elektra does the same thing. And that juxtaposition of the two images is very, very striking, I think. With Elektra, like we mentioned, there's a freedom and openness to what's around it in that large panel. With Murdock, he's in a much smaller panel, and the camera looks like it's got a zoomed-in lens compared to the wide angle for Elektra. You can see very, very little of the wider world around him, and it feels quite cramped. It's all coming together to speak of the situation, both mentally and physically for Murdock. Maleev has kept him restricted, small, stuck in corners, lacking movement, for the opening of both pages here, and it's an effect that's hard not to admire. If we skip 2 pages, but again, just on that page we will skip, you can see the exact same visual style enforced. But anyway, skipping to this page next, we get some interesting examples of just how hard Maleev is driving home this effect. We move from Murdock's face in close-up, black background, full focus on him, to a 3/4 body shot of Elektra. Again, she's got more room to breathe, she's not as restricted as he is, not as intensely focused, and as we read the captions, the other intention of that starts to become clearer. Murdock is willing himself not to say to Elektra, in essence, that he misses her. He misses a time when all this was so much less complicated. So we come to see this freedom around Elektra not just as an understanding of how trapped Murdock is, but also as a reflection of the way he views Elektra, of how he wants to be part of that freedom that she represents to him. It adds an emotional weight that resonates a bit more than just Murdock trapped by paparazzi, and it's a very smart move from both Bendis and Maleev, and it now starts to reframe some of that other visual language you've already understood. The most interesting to me is Murdock in his suit, and Elektra in her costume, red, like his Daredevil suit. The ribbon from her costume starts to correlate with his tie blowing in the wind, it's drawn very, very similarly, a reflection of the Daredevil ideal that hangs around his neck, strangling and suffocating him, but also their continued link between his entrapment and her freedom. In that final panel, with Elektra looking out at the world, her ribbon billowing out towards freedom, she's being hit by light, but Murdock is in shadow, turning away, trapped and framed within that bit of building behind him. There's nothing available, and his tie blows in the opposite direction. Again, it reflects the duality of his life, of his personality, the hero and the man, the freedom and the prison. But when you pick up this comic to read it, sure, you're not necessarily getting all of that, but what Bendis and Maleev and Hollingsworth are trying to do is give you enough hints, enough visuals to start to lead you that way, to inform you that that's what they're saying and that's what they mean. And it will start to feed into your reading. Because if Maleev, for example, rendered these pages with big, large, wide imagery, Murdock wouldn't feel trapped, he wouldn't be stuck there. If Bendis didn't write Murdock into wearing his suit, but instead his costume, you'd lose a crucial dynamic. And of course, if Hollingsworth hadn't muted everything and washed these pages in that icy cold blue, it wouldn't be as haunting and distant as it is. It's a really beautiful way to encapsulate so many of the themes being talked about in the issue and in this run. It's a really great example of a mainstream superhero comic being smart in its execution and being imbued with this kind of really clever visual language and themes by a creative team that were really working at the height of their game. This is a true mastery of visual language, and a lot of that is down to the way that Alex Maleev has interpreted the page, interpreted his job in rendering that page, and interpreted the meaning and the thoughts behind the ideas that are going into the page. This is just layers of great visual language that's being hidden under the very simple premise of the story being told by Bendis and Maleev. It's all there and it's all on the page for your brain and you and your subconscious to be led by. Without the framing of the panels, without the colours, you wouldn't have the exact same emotional response from this page, and the book would suffer because of it. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, we'd love it if you check out our Patreon page where you can support us, and in thanks you get access to tons and tons and tons of regularly updated extra content. For more comics talk and analysis, you can find me on Twitter at HassanOE, and finally hit subscribe to keep up to date with all the latest Strip Panel Naked episodes, and I'll see you next time.